The silent cry in the night. The winter wind howled like a restless spirit outside James Calloway's small craftsman house, rattling the windows and slipping through the cracks beneath the doors. Inside, the warmth of the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows against the old wooden walls. James cradled his cup of tea, relishing the rare comfort in the otherwise lonely home. 52 years in this quiet town, and though it had never felt crowded, the nights had started to feel emptier since his wife passed a decade ago. He sighed, rubbing his tired eyes before turning his attention back to the book resting on his lap. The story was a predictable mystery novel, something to pass the time more than anything. He had just started a new chapter when he heard it. A sound so faint, so fragile, that for a moment he thought he had imagined it. Knock, knock. James frowned, setting his book aside. He sat still for a moment, listening. The wind screamed against the house, trees groaning under the weight of the snowfall outside. He almost convinced himself it was nothing when. Knock, knock. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone was at the door. James placed his tea on the side table and pushed himself up from the old leather chair, his joints stiff from the cold. His house wasn't exactly in the busiest part of town. In fact, the last time he had a visitor at this hour was nearly a year ago when the neighbor's cat had somehow ended up on his porch. Cautiously, he walked toward the door. Peering through the peephole, all he could see was darkness. His porch light had gone out last week, and he had yet to fix it. He reached for the handle but hesitated. Who in their right mind would be out in this kind of weather? Pulling his coat tighter around him, he unlatched the door and cracked it open. At first, he saw nothing but snow swirling in the wind. But then, his breath caught in his throat. Two small figures huddled together, barely visible in the dim light from inside. Two children. James flung the door open wider, his heart racing. The tiny figures flinched at the rush of cold air that followed. His breath caught in his throat as he took in the sight before him, two little girls, twins, dressed in ragged clothes soaked through from the snow. They were curled into each other, trembling violently, their small hands clutching at each other as if afraid to let go. James' stomach twisted. Oh my God, he stepped forward, kneeling down. Hey there, little ones. What are you doing out here? The girls didn't answer. They barely moved, their bodies stiff with cold. One of them, her dark curls matted against her face, lifted her head slightly, her lips trembling, but no words came out. The other clung to her like a lifeline, her face buried against her sister's shoulder. James' eyes darted around, scanning the street for anyone else, any sign of a frantic parent searching for their lost children. But there was nothing. Just the endless snowfall, covering everything in its silent embrace. Then he saw it. A small, crumpled piece of paper tucked into the folds of one of the girl's tattered coats. His hands shook as he reached for it, his fingers brushing against the frozen fabric. Slowly, he unfolded the note. The handwriting was hurried, shaky. As if written in desperation. Please, keep them safe. He's coming. James felt his blood turn to ice. He looked down at the girls again, his mind racing. Who had left them here? Who was he? And what were they running from? One of the girls whimpered softly, her small frame racked with shivers. Without another thought, James scooped them both up into his arms. They were so light, too light. He could feel their ribs through the thin fabric of their clothes. His heart clenched at the realization. All right, I got you, he murmured, pulling them against his chest as he carried them inside. Let's get you warm. As soon as the door shut behind them, James rushed to the fireplace. He knelt down, setting the girls in front of the fire's glow. The warmth licked at their frozen skin, their shivers gradually slowing. He moved quickly, grabbing the thickest blankets he could find and wrapping them up tightly. Still, neither girl spoke. James ran a hand through his graying hair, exhaling sharply. He needed to call someone, the police, child services, anyone who could help. But something stopped him. The note. Please, keep them safe. He's coming. There was something about those words. Something that sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. These girls weren't just lost. They were running from something. Or someone. James glanced at them again. The one with dark curls had her eyes closed, exhaustion finally overtaking her. The other, her tiny fingers gripping the edge of the blanket, stared at him with wide, fearful eyes. He crouched down, his voice gentle. Hey, sweetheart. Can you tell me your name? The girl hesitated. Her lips parted, and for a moment, James thought she was going to answer. But instead, she simply shook her head and shrank further into the blanket. James sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. He needed to be careful. These girls were terrified, and whatever they had been through, they weren't ready to talk about it yet. Okay, he said softly. That's all right. You don't have to talk. He stood up, his mind already racing with what to do next. Food. They needed food. He made his way to the kitchen, moving on autopilot as he prepared something simple but warm, hot cocoa and a plate of toast with butter. He didn't know if they'd eat much, but they needed something in their bellies. When he returned, the dark-haired girl had woken up. She was staring at him now, her small hands clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Her sister, the one with the frightened eyes, had shifted closer to her, as if seeking comfort. James placed the tray on the small table beside them. I made you some cocoa, he said gently. And some toast. It's not much, but it'll help warm you up. For a long moment, neither girl moved. Then, slowly, the dark-haired one reached out and took the cup, her fingers wrapped tightly around the warm ceramic. She took a small sip, then another. The other girl hesitated, then followed her lead. James let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. They were safe. For now. But the questions in his mind refused to quiet. Who had left them here? Who was he? And most importantly, how far would he go to find them? Shadows in the snow. The wind outside howled with fury, rattling the windows of James Calloway's house like a desperate spirit trying to get inside. The fire in the hearth flickered, casting long shadows across the room. The two little girls huddled under the thick blankets James had wrapped around them, their small hands clutching the warm cups of cocoa he had given them. James sat across from them in his worn-out armchair, studying them in the dim light. His mind raced with questions. Who were they? Where had they come from? And most importantly, who was looking for them? The note in his pocket burned like an ember against his skin. Please, keep them safe. He's coming. James exhaled sharply, trying to push away the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. He wasn't a man who scared easily, he had seen his share of hardship in life. He had fought in wars, lost loved ones, built a life from nothing. But this was different. There was something deeply unsettling about these two tiny girls showing up on his doorstep, silent and trembling, in the dead of night. They were running from something. Or someone. James took a slow sip of his tea, careful not to startle them. The dark-haired twin, the one who had taken the first sip of cocoa, watched him carefully. Her eyes, large and dark, held a depth far beyond her years. The other girl, the more timid one, was still curled into herself, gripping the edge of her blanket as if it were the only thing keeping her safe. He leaned forward slightly, softening his voice. I won't ask too many questions tonight, he said gently. But I need to know, are you two all right? The dark-haired girl nodded slowly, but the fear in her eyes didn't fade. James pressed his lips together. He could tell they weren't all right. They were exhausted, freezing, and, more than anything, terrified. He decided to try again. "My name is James," he said, offering a small smile. "You're safe here, I promise." Silence. Then, after a long pause, the dark-haired girl spoke. "Maya." James' chest tightened. Finally, a name. He turned to the other girl, keeping his voice as calm as possible. "And you?" The timid girl hesitated. Then, so quietly it was almost a whisper, she said, "Lena." James let out a slow breath. Maya and Lena. Those are beautiful names. Lena curled closer to her sister, as if saying their names out loud had made them vulnerable. James decided not to press any further. He had gotten more than he expected tonight. Instead, he stood and walked to the hallway closet, pulling out a few extra pillows and a large, soft comforter. He brought them over to the couch, arranging them as best as he could to make a comfortable sleeping space. "You two can sleep here tonight," he said, motioning to the couch. "It's warm, and you'll be safe." The girls didn't move at first. Maya's eyes darted to the front door, and James didn't miss it. She was afraid of someone coming. James crouched down, looking her in the eyes. "No one is going to hurt you here," he said firmly. "I locked the doors. No one is getting in." Maya swallowed hard but nodded. Slowly, she helped Lena onto the couch, making sure her sister was wrapped tightly in the blankets before settling in beside her. James stood up, rubbing his hands together. "If you need anything, I'll be right here." Neither girl responded, but they didn't need to. Their exhaustion was catching up with them. Within minutes, Lena's eyes fluttered shut, her small body relaxing into the warmth of the couch. Maya stayed awake a little longer, her fingers gripping the edge of her blanket. But eventually, she, too, succumbed to sleep. James stood there for a long moment, watching them. His mind was screaming at him. He needed to call the police. He needed to let someone know what was going on. But something held him back. The note. Whoever left these girls here had been desperate. And whoever he was, the person they were running from, James had the sinking feeling that getting the authorities involved might put them in even more danger. Still, he needed answers. Quietly, he walked to the small table near the front door, where he had placed the crumpled note. He picked it up again, running his fingers over the words. The handwriting was shaky, as if the person writing it had been in a hurry. Or terrified. He turned the paper over, looking for any more clues. And that's when he noticed something else. A tiny smudge of red blood. James' breath hitched. Whoever had written this note had been hurt. Maybe worse. His grip on the paper tightened. Whoever left these girls here had risked everything to do so. And that meant, whoever was looking for them would stop at nothing to get them back. James exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. If he wanted to get answers, he would have to do it carefully. He grabbed his coat and stepped toward the door, making sure the locks were secured. Then, just to be safe, he reached under the side table and pulled out his old revolver. It had been years since he last fired it, but he knew it still worked. Sliding it into the pocket of his coat, he turned back toward the sleeping girls. Whatever storm they had come from, James had a feeling it wasn't over yet. And when it came knocking again, he would be ready. The footsteps in the snow. James Calloway sat in his old leather armchair, staring into the flickering fire. The warmth did little to ease the chill creeping up his spine. The two little girls, Maya and Lena, were curled up on the couch, their faces peaceful in sleep, but James knew the storm they had brought to his doorstep was far from over. He had spent years living in solitude, the quiet of his small town comforting in its routine. But now? His home felt like a fragile sanctuary, a single gust away from crumbling under the weight of the unknown. His fingers absently traced the edge of the crumpled note in his pocket. "Please, keep them safe." He's coming. Who was coming? And why? The words haunted him, echoing in his mind like a distant warning bell. He knew he should go to the police, but something deep in his gut told him that doing so might only bring more danger. The bloodstain on the note wasn't just a plea for help, it was a sign of desperation. Someone had risked their life to get Maya and Lena here. And now they were his responsibility. James sighed, pushing himself up from his chair. He moved quietly, careful not to wake the girls, and stepped to the front door. He reached for the light switch but hesitated, deciding against turning it on. If someone was out there, he didn't want to alert them. Instead, he peeked through the small window beside the door. At first, all he saw was darkness. Snow blanketed the ground, the soft glow of the street lamp barely cutting through the swirling frost. Then, movement. His pulse quickened. A shadow shifted at the far end of his front yard. James narrowed his eyes, gripping the doorframe. His first instinct was to grab his revolver, but he forced himself to stay calm. Maybe it was nothing, just an animal, or a neighbor walking home late. But then he saw them. Footsteps. Fresh ones. Leading right up to his porch. James swallowed hard. He hadn't heard anyone knock, but someone had been here. Recently. He turned, glancing back at the couch where Maya and Lena lay fast asleep. Their small chests rose and fell with each breath, completely unaware of the danger lurking outside. James tightened his jaw. If someone thought they could take these girls, they were wrong. The night stretched on, heavy with an eerie stillness. James stayed by the door for nearly an hour, watching, waiting. The shadow never moved again, and no more footsteps appeared. Eventually, he forced himself to sit back down, though he kept his revolver within arm's reach. The hours ticked by, and exhaustion pulled at his eyelids. His body begged for rest, but his mind refused to let go of its grip on the situation. He must have dozed off at some point because the next thing he knew, a small, frightened voice was whispering his name. "Mr. James?" James jolted awake, his hand instinctively reaching for his revolver before his eyes focused on the trembling figure in front of him. Maya. Her dark eyes were wide with fear, her tiny fingers clutching the edge of her blanket. James sat up straight, pushing away the last traces of sleep. "What is it, sweetheart?" She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's here." James' breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded against his ribs as he reached for the revolver, his fingers wrapping around the cool metal. "How do you know?" he asked, keeping his voice calm even as dread curled around his chest. Maya swallowed hard. "I heard him." She turned toward the window, her tiny frame barely visible in the dim light. Outside. Walking. James' grip on the gun tightened. He had seen those footprints. Someone had been out there. He stood up slowly, moving toward the front door. The old wooden floor creaked under his weight, and Maya flinched at the sound. James crouched beside her, his voice gentle but firm. "You and Lena stay here, okay? Don't move unless I say so." Maya nodded, gripping the blanket tighter. James stepped carefully to the window again, peering outside. The street was empty. Snowflakes drifted lazily under the glow of the street lamp, painting an almost peaceful picture. Almost. But then he saw it. Another set of footsteps. Leading away from his house. James felt a sharp chill crawl up his spine. Whoever had been outside had gotten closer than before, too close. But now they were gone. For now. His fingers tightened around the revolver. He had a bad feeling this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Dawn broke with a quiet stillness. The golden hues of the rising sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered street, but James felt no relief. He had barely slept, his body still humming with tension. Maya and Lena were still curled up on the couch, their faces peaceful in the morning light. James sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. He needed to figure out what to do next. He couldn't just wait for whoever was looking for these girls to come knocking again. No. It was time to get some answers. He needed to find out who left them on his doorstep. And more importantly, who they were running from. Secrets in the snow. The morning air was sharp with the crisp bite of winter, but James Calloway barely noticed. He stood on his porch, staring at the footprints in the snow, his thoughts tangled in a storm of questions. Who had been out here last night? Had they been watching the house? Waiting for an opportunity to take Maya and Lena? He turned back toward the girls, still curled up in the warm cocoon of blankets on his couch. Their innocent faces were peaceful in sleep, but James knew that peace was fragile. Something, or someone, was coming for them. And he was going to find out who. The search for answers. James wasn't a man who ran to the authorities for help, not because he didn't trust them, but because he knew how often the system failed people who needed it most. He had spent decades watching injustices be swept under the rug, especially in a town as small as this one. If Maya and Lena were running from someone dangerous, he wasn't about to put their fate in the hands of a bureaucracy that might send them straight back into harm's way. He needed to find out the truth himself. James grabbed his coat and stepped outside, careful not to disturb the fresh snow as he examined the footprints more closely. They were deep, heavier than his own. Whoever made them was a large man, probably wearing boots. The trail led away from his house, disappearing down the road. James followed it cautiously, glancing around to make sure he wasn't being watched. The tracks veered toward an alleyway between two old buildings. James hesitated, glancing up at the brick walls that loomed over him. The town was quiet in the early morning hours, but something about the silence felt unnatural, too still, too expectant. He took a breath and stepped forward. Halfway down the alley, he saw it. A smear of blood on the wall. James' stomach clenched. Someone had been hurt here. Recently. He scanned the ground, and that's when he found something even more disturbing. A torn piece of fabric. A child's fabric. His grip tightened around the scrap of cloth as his mind raced. Was this from Maya or Lena? Had they been hurt before they reached his doorstep? Or worse? Had someone else been taken? James turned on his heel and rushed back toward the house, his boots crunching through the snow. He had left the girls alone for too long. If someone was desperate enough to bleed in the streets while searching for them, there was no telling what they might try next. Whispers of the past. When James stepped back inside, he found Maya sitting up on the couch, wide-eyed and alert. "You left," she said quietly. "I just stepped out for a minute," James assured her, kneeling beside her. "I needed to check something." Maya's tiny hands gripped the blanket, her knuckles white. Was he there? James paused. Who? She swallowed hard. The man in the dark coat. A cold weight settled in James' chest. You saw him? Maya nodded slowly, her lower lip trembling. Last night. I woke up before Lena did. I saw him outside the window. James fought to keep his expression neutral. He didn't want to scare her, but the thought of someone standing outside in the darkness, watching them, sent a ripple of unease through him. What did he look like? James asked gently. Maya shook her head. I don't know. He had a big coat. And his face was, she hesitated, her small hands balling into fists. It was hard to see. But I know it was him. James exhaled slowly. How do you know? Maya's gaze flickered to Lena, who was still asleep. Then, she leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. Because he's the one we ran from. James felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't just some lost child case. This wasn't an accident. These girls were hiding from someone. And now, that someone knew exactly where they were. A name from the darkness. James sat with Maya for a long time, letting her gather her thoughts. Eventually, Lena woke up, rubbing her eyes sleepily. She looked at Maya first, then at James, and immediately sensed something was wrong. Did he come back? Lena's voice was small, but James heard the fear beneath it. Maya glanced at James hesitantly, as if asking for permission. It's okay, he told her. You can tell me. Maya took a deep breath. His name is Dawson. James felt the name settle in his bones like a bad omen. Who is he? He asked carefully. Maya's hands clutched the fabric of her nightgown. He took us from our home. James' blood ran cold. Your home? Maya nodded, tears brimming in her dark eyes. Our mama tried to stop him, but he hurt her. He said no one would come looking for us. That no one would care. Lena sniffled, wiping her nose with the sleeve of her oversized shirt. But someone did, she whispered. She got us out. She brought us here. James inhaled sharply. Who? Maya's voice was barely audible. Her name was Miss Evelyn. James' chest ached. He didn't know who Miss Evelyn was, but she had risked everything to get these girls away from Dawson. And now, he was almost certain. She was the one who left the note. The same note stained with blood. And if Dawson was still looking for the girls, then that meant Miss Evelyn was likely dead. The storm approaches. James stood, his mind racing. He had to act fast. If Dawson had found them once, he would find them again. James grabbed his coat and moved toward the door. Where are you going? Maya asked, her voice shaking. James turned back, softening his expression. I need to make sure we're safe. Stay inside. Don't open the door for anyone but me. Maya nodded, though fear flickered in her eyes. James hesitated, then knelt in front of them. Listen to me. I won't let anything happen to you. Do you believe me? Lena hesitated, then nodded. Okay. James forced a reassuring smile. Good girls. Then, he stepped outside into the cold morning air. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't a hero. But these girls needed him. And James Calloway would die before he let Dawson take them, shadows of the past. The winter air was sharp and unforgiving as James Calloway stepped outside, his breath curling in the icy wind. The morning sun had barely risen, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow-covered streets. Every footprint in the frost felt like a clue, an unwelcome reminder that someone dangerous was out there, looking for Maya and Lena. James had never been the kind of man to involve himself in things beyond his quiet little world, but everything had changed the moment he found those two shivering girls on his doorstep. He had no choice but to step into the unknown now. And the first step was finding out who Dawson really was. Digging for the truth. James knew the town well. He had lived here all his life, watching it change, watching people come and go. If Dawson was lurking nearby, someone had to know something. He started at the one place where rumors always lived longer than memories, the Silver Lantern Diner. The bell jingled as he pushed open the door, the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon thick in the air. A few locals sat at the counter, stirring their cups absent-mindedly while an old radio hummed softly in the background. Behind the counter, Doris, who had owned the diner for as long as James could remember, gave him a sharp look. James Calloway, she said, wiping her hands on her apron. You don't usually come in this early. What's got you up and moving? James slid onto a stool, lowering his voice. I need information. Doris raised an eyebrow. Now that's a first. About what? He hesitated for only a moment before speaking. A man named Dawson. Big guy. Wears a dark coat. Might be new in town. Doris' face changed instantly. The playful spark in her eyes faded, replaced by something unreadable. She leaned forward, voice low. James, where'd you hear that name? James' gut twisted. The fact that she recognized the name at all meant trouble. I need to know, he pressed. Who is he? Doris exhaled, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Then, she lowered her voice even further. Dawson isn't from around here, but people like him don't need to be. He's the kind that leaves a trail of fear wherever he goes. The kind you don't ask questions about. James' hands clenched under the counter. What's he done? Doris shook her head. I don't know specifics, but I know enough. He's been through here before. Always looking for something, or someone. Last time, a woman came through town asking for help. Real desperate. I think she was hiding from him. James' pulse quickened. Miss Evelyn? Doris' eyes widened. You knew her? James hesitated. She helped 2 little girls escape from Dawson. Doris inhaled sharply. Then you need to be careful, James. If she crossed Dawson, she's either dead, or she's running for her life. James swallowed the lump in his throat. Dead. The word echoed in his mind. He didn't want to believe it, but deep down, he knew. He had seen the bloodstains, the note. Miss Evelyn hadn't run. She had sacrificed herself. And Dawson was still hunting. The hunter in the shadows. James left the diner feeling the weight of the morning pressing down on him. The sun had fully risen now, casting its weak winter glow across the town. But even in daylight, something felt off. As he walked back toward his house, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder. Nothing. But he knew better than to trust his eyes. James picked up his pace, boots crunching against the snow. He turned down Maple Lane, his house now in sight, just a few steps away. Then he saw it. A black car parked across the street. Engine running. Windows tinted too dark to see inside. James stopped cold. It hadn't been there when he left. The moment his eyes locked on the car, the engine cut off. The door opened. And a man stepped out. A tall man. Broad shoulders, heavy boots crunching in the snow. His dark coat was buttoned up tight, but James could see the rough edge of a scar across his jaw. His heart pounded. It was him. Dawson. James forced himself to stay calm, even as his fists clenched. The man tilted his head, studying James with sharp, assessing eyes. Then, he took a slow step forward. Morning, Dawson said, his voice low, measured. Nice town you got here. James didn't respond. Dawson gave a slow smile, but it never reached his eyes. You wouldn't happen to have seen a couple of kids, would you? James met his gaze, refusing to let the fear show. Why? Dawson exhaled, shaking his head. Because they're mine. James' stomach turned. The way he said it made James' skin crawl. He had heard plenty of men lay claim to things that didn't belong to them, but this was different. Dawson took another step forward. They belong to me, he said, softer now, almost like a whisper. And I've come to take them home. James' blood ran cold. Home. The very thought of those girls being dragged back into Dawson's grasp made his chest tighten. He forced himself to stay calm. I don't know what you're talking about. Dawson's smile faded. I think you do. James didn't flinch. Then you think wrong. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the winter wind howling between them. Then, Dawson exhaled. All right, he said, his tone almost amused. Have it your way. He turned, stepping back toward the car. He opened the door but hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. "You seem like a smart man, Calloway," he said. "So let me give you some advice." His smile was gone now, his expression like ice. "Don't get in my way." James watched as Dawson slid into the driver's seat and pulled away, the black car disappearing down the snowy street. Only when the taillights vanished did James finally exhale, his hands trembling with adrenaline. He turned toward his house and hurried inside, bolting the door behind him. Maya and Lena were exactly where he left them, still huddled on the couch. But the moment they saw his face, their eyes widened in fear. James didn't have to say anything. They already knew. He knelt down beside them, his voice steady, despite the fear curling in his chest. "He's here," he told them. "But I won't let him take you." Maya's lips quivered. "What do we do?" James glanced toward the window, his mind racing. There was only one thing to do now. Run, the final stand. The old grandfather clock in James Calloway's living room ticked steadily, but to him, each second felt like a drumbeat leading to war. Dawson had finally arrived. The shadow looming over Maya and Lena's fragile world had taken shape, and it was worse than James had imagined. He had spent most of his life in quiet solitude, running his little cafe, staying out of trouble. But fate had handed him two little girls with tear-streaked faces, and now, trouble had found him. There was no more time for second-guessing. James had to make a choice, fight or run. And running only worked for so long. A desperate escape. James knelt beside Maya and Lena, his hands gripping theirs tightly. "We need to go," he whispered. "Right now." Maya's eyes flickered with fear, but she nodded. Lena clung to his arm, her small body trembling. "Where?" she asked. James had already made his decision. "There's a cabin," he said, standing quickly. "About 20 miles from here. It's deep in the woods. No roads, no streetlights. No one will find us there." James owned the cabin, though he hadn't used it in years. It had belonged to his grandfather, a hunting retreat back when life was simpler. If they could make it there, they'd have a fighting chance. But first, they had to escape the town unseen. James grabbed his old duffel bag, stuffing it with clothes, blankets, and the little bit of cash he kept hidden. He hesitated, then opened a drawer in the hallway, retrieving the Smith & Wesson revolver he hadn't touched in over a decade. He wasn't a violent man. He didn't believe in solving problems with bullets. But this wasn't just a problem. This was survival. The chase begins. The wind howled as James led the girls out the back door. He had parked his truck behind the house earlier, anticipating this exact moment. They ran, boots crunching over the snow, breaths visible in the frigid air. James yanked open the truck door, ushering the girls inside. "Stay down," he ordered, glancing around the quiet neighborhood. No sign of Dawson. Yet. James slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and rolled out onto the dark street. He kept his headlights off for as long as he dared, navigating by memory. They were barely 3 blocks away when he saw it, headlights in the rearview mirror. A black car. Dawson. James tightened his grip on the wheel. "Hold on," he muttered. The truck roared forward, tires skidding slightly on the icy road. Dawson's car sped up in response, closing the gap. James turned onto the highway, pushing the speedometer past 50, then 60. The road stretched ahead, leading out of town and toward the dense, endless forest. But Dawson was gaining. James' mind raced. He had an idea, but it was risky. The icy gamble. Up ahead, the road curved sharply around Pine Hollow Creek. A wooden bridge spanned the frozen water, but the ice beneath wasn't strong enough to hold the weight of a car. James had played on that ice as a boy. He knew it would crack. And if he could lure Dawson onto it? James exhaled sharply. It was a hell of a gamble. He made his move. Instead of taking the bridge, he jerked the wheel hard to the right, plowing straight onto the frozen creek. The truck skidded violently, ice groaning beneath the tires. Maya and Lena shrieked, clinging to each other as James fought for control. Behind them, Dawson hesitated for only a second, then followed. The moment his car hit the ice, James knew he had him. The surface beneath them cracked, a loud, echoing boom splitting through the night. James didn't stop. He kept moving, reaching the far bank just as Dawson's car began to sink. James slammed the truck into park, watching as Dawson wrenched open his door, scrambling onto the roof as the vehicle dipped lower into the freezing black water. For the first time, James saw something in Dawson's eyes besides cold calculation, panic. Dawson had been the hunter. Now, he was drowning. James could have left him. He should have left him. But he didn't. He jumped out of the truck, ran to the edge of the broken ice, and threw a rope toward the sinking man. "Take it!" James shouted. Dawson hesitated. His pride fought against his desperation. But the freezing water had no mercy, and his hands were already turning blue. Finally, he grabbed the rope. James pulled. With every ounce of strength he had left, he yanked Dawson free from the abyss, dragging him onto solid ground. Dawson collapsed, coughing violently, steam rising from his soaked clothes in the cold air. He stared up at James, pure disbelief in his expression. "Why?" he rasped. James took a deep breath, his own body trembling. "Because those girls? They're not yours." Dawson's face twisted in anger, but he was too weak to fight. He slumped forward, defeated. A new beginning. Dawson was still barely conscious when James heard the sound of sirens. He turned. Police cars. James exhaled. Finally. Sheriff Carter was the first out of his vehicle, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. "Got a call from Doris at the diner," he said. "Said you were in trouble." James nodded, gesturing to Dawson. "He's the one you want." Carter knelt beside Dawson, taking in the burned-in tattoos on his wrists, gang symbols. "We've been looking for this son of a gun for a while," he muttered. "You just saved us a hell of a chase, Calloway." James felt relief flood his body. It was over. Maya and Lena were safe. Carter glanced at the truck, where the two little girls sat watching with wide, exhausted eyes. "What about them?" he asked. James looked at them, really looked. He had once thought of himself as a man who lived alone, destined for quiet days and quiet nights. But life had given him something better. Something worth fighting for. "They stay with me," James said firmly. "I'll adopt them." Maya gasped. Lena covered her mouth with both hands. James knelt in front of them, his voice soft. "If you'll have me." For a moment, they didn't speak. Then, Maya launched herself into his arms. "Yes," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Yes." James held them both close, his chest tight with emotion. This wasn't just survival. This was family. Epilogue. A few weeks later, James stood outside his cafe, watching Maya and Lena chase each other through the fresh snow. They laughed, their faces bright and full of life. Dawson was in prison, facing charges for crimes that stretched across several states. He wouldn't be coming back. Miss Evelyn's sacrifice had not been in vain. James had lost many things in life. His parents. His youth. His peace. But standing there, watching the girls he now called his daughters, he knew one thing for certain. He had won something far greater. A second chance. A new beginning. And for the first time in years, James Calloway smiled.